He reeked so badly in his final weeks that visitors gagged when they crossed the threshold. His throat was rotting from the inside out, tumors bursting until every swallow was agony, his voice reduced to a rasp you had to lean into to hear. Ulysses S. Grant, the man who crushed Robert E. Lee, spent his last days skeletal, wrapped in shawls, scribbling furiously through the stench of his own decay, desperate to finish his memoirs before cancer silenced him forever. This was the horrible death of Ulysses S. Grant, a general who won every war but lost the last battle with his own body. Let's get into it. But before we do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Ulysses S. Grant was born on April 27, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. When he entered West Point at the age of 17, he was remembered not for brilliance in the classroom, but for an uncommon mastery of horses, quiet, deliberate, and with a calm hand that impressed all who watched. A fellow cadet recalled that Grant could ride with such ease that no horse ever seemed beyond his control, a talent that set him apart more than any display of military theory or academic skill. So how then did this unassuming boy, with neither interest in soldiery nor ambition for politics, end up the commanding general who forced Robert E. Lee to surrender and twice held the presidency of the United States? Grant graduated in 1843, ranked in the middle of his class, and was sent west. He found the monotony of garrison life stifling, and later admitted he would have resigned if war had not intervened. In Mexico, however, he proved himself. During the Battle of Monterrey, he made a daring ride under sniper fire, clinging sideways to his horse with one arm while carrying dispatches with the other. At Chapultepec, he helped haul a cannon into a church steeple, firing on enemy troops below in a move equal parts reckless and ingenious. Officers noted his composure under fire, his ability to move men in the chaos of battle, and his willingness to take risks others would have avoided. Yet despite distinction, he confessed privately that he thought the war was unjust, calling it one of conquest rather than defense. After peace returned, so did discontent. Stationed in Oregon and California, far from Julia Dent, the woman he loved and had married in 1848, he grew lonely. Alcohol became his refuge. By 1854, his drinking so alarmed superiors that he resigned his commission, leaving the Army in disgrace. Reduced to odd jobs and selling firewood in the streets of St. Louis, the man who had once shown such daring in Mexico seemed destined for obscurity. He struggled to provide for his family, failed at farming and business ventures, and carried the reputation of a drunkard. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, few would have predicted that this failed officer, forgotten by nearly everyone beyond his small circle, would return to command vast armies and secure a place among the nation's most consequential leaders. The war that began as a rebellion gave Grant his second chance. Commissioned first to command volunteers in Illinois, he quickly proved himself at Fort Donelson in February 1862. When the Confederates asked for terms, he replied with the words that made him famous: "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender." Newspapers hailed him as Unconditional Surrender Grant, and the name stuck. At Shiloh, weeks later, his army suffered staggering losses, and rumors of drunkenness circulated through the press. But Lincoln stood by him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." That defense saved Grant's career, and from that moment his rise was relentless. At Vicksburg in 1863, he executed one of the most brilliant campaigns of the war, cutting off a Confederate stronghold and forcing surrender after a long siege. A year later, he was brought east, placed in command of all Union armies, and given the task of finally defeating Robert E. Lee. His strategy was brutal, marked by relentless pressure and horrific casualties, but it worked. In April 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant, who offered generous terms and forbade his men to celebrate at the enemy's humiliation. In 4 years, he had risen from obscurity to the most celebrated soldier in the nation, the man credited with preserving the Union. Grant was elevated to the presidency in 1868. When he entered office at the age of 46, he was celebrated as the victorious general of the Civil War, modest in bearing, devoted to the Union, and honored across the nation as a soldier who had forced Lee's surrender. Supporters wrote that his name was revered in every loyal household, that his reputation for honesty and resolve made him the natural choice to guide Reconstruction, and that his very presence in the White House was proof of the Republic's survival. How, then, did this image of integrity and strength give way to an administration remembered as both progressive and tainted? Grant's presidency began with enormous public trust, and in some respects he justified it. He pressed Congress to pass the Enforcement Acts, using federal troops and the new Department of Justice to crush the Ku Klux Klan. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, a measure that promised equal access to public accommodations. He supported the creation of Yellowstone, the first national park in American history, a legacy of conservation that endures. On paper, these achievements marked him as a reformer, unusual among generals who had turned to politics. Yet scandal followed scandal, and his own weaknesses made them worse. He remained loyal to friends and associates who proved corrupt, a failing that critics never forgave. The Credit Mobile affair exposed bribery at the highest levels of government. The whiskey ring revealed a vast network of tax fraud that implicated officials close to the president. The Panic of 1873 triggered the worst depression the country had yet experienced. And Grant's hard money policies, though consistent with his principles, deepened the misery of farmers and workers. By the end of his second term, his reputation was battered, not because he had stolen, but because he seemed unable or unwilling to see that others had. Even so, Grant left office admired as a Union's general, if not as a statesman. Crowds gathered to bid him farewell, and foreign leaders welcomed him abroad as a conquering hero. But the contrast between the man who had once defeated secession and the leader who had failed to control corruption in his own house was clear. The question is, did this figure of both triumph and disappointment come to spend his final years not in honor, but in ruin, disease, and despair? The turning point came in the summer of 1884 during what should have been a triumph. At 62 years old, Ulysses S. Grant attended a reunion of Civil War veterans at Ocean Grove, New Jersey. He rose to a standing ovation from 10,000 men who had once marched under his command. This was his last public appearance, though no one in the crowd could have guessed it. That same summer, he began to complain of a sore throat, a small irritation at first, which he dismissed as trivial. He delayed seeing a doctor for months, but in October came the verdict: cancer of the throat, a condition almost certainly caused by the cigars he had smoked incessantly, sometimes 20 in a single day. It was a mortal sentence, and it struck not the man who had fallen in battle, but the general who had survived every shot and shell, only to be undone by a habit carried quietly for decades. Grant tried to keep the truth from Julia, his wife of nearly 40 years, but she learned it soon enough from the family physician. In the early months of 1885, the public too was told. In March, the New York Times announced that the general was dying, a headline that sent tremors of grief across the nation. Crowds gathered outside his house, well-wishers sent letters by the hundreds, and even old enemies expressed sorrow. But sympathy, however great, did nothing to ease his fear that he would leave Julia and their children with nothing. For although Grant was famous, he was nearly penniless. The financial ruin had come as suddenly as the cancer. Only weeks before the diagnosis, the investment firm of Grant & Ward collapsed in a spectacular fraud. Ferdinand Ward, hailed in the papers as the young Napoleon of finance, had in fact built a pyramid of lies, using Grant's name to lure investors, then robbing them blind. When the firm failed in May of 1884, it left not only its clients ruined, but the general himself. Grant had invested all he possessed and borrowed heavily besides. When the debts were called in, his fortune amounted to just $80 in cash. For the man who had once commanded 500,000 soldiers, the humiliation was complete. He had defeated Lee, but he had been defeated by a swindler. Congress, shamed by the spectacle of a bankrupt hero, intervened. In March of 1885, it restored him to the rank of General of the Army with a full pension of $3,000 per year. It was a measure of relief, though hardly wealth, and it came only because he had once been forced to resign his commission when he entered the presidency. Without it, Julia would have been left destitute. With it, she was at least assured of survival. But for Grant himself, the gesture carried a cruel irony. The pension came too late to comfort him because his body was already failing. By the spring of 1885, the transformation was visible to all who saw him. His voice grew hoarse, his throat raw, and swallowing became an agony. He wrapped himself in scarves to hide the swelling at his neck, but whispers spread nonetheless. Visitors noted his drawn face, his stooped figure, and his silence where once he had been steady if reserved. For a man celebrated for iron endurance, the disease was a public humiliation. The turning point was not just medical, but personal and financial, a triple blow that struck in swift succession. In 1 year, Grant went from celebrated guest of honor, hailed by the cheers of his comrades, to a man trapped in a ruined body, ruined finances, and the knowledge that his death was being chronicled in the nation's papers even before it came. The hero of Appomattox, who had once stood at the pinnacle of American triumph, now faced his decline with dread. Some observers saw a lesson in coincidence, that fate had contrived to strike him down in precisely the ways he least expected. Whether by design or chance, the result was the same. The general who had led armies without fear now feared for his family's survival. The president who had once overseen the rebuilding of a nation now sat ruined in his own home. And the soldier who had survived every field of battle now found himself undone by a small wound in the throat that could not heal. With his body wasting away, the general began to lose weight at a terrifying pace. His frame, which had once carried 180 pounds in middle age, withered to less than 130. He could swallow little more than milk, broth, or bits of scraped fruit, while solid food brought agony that no treatment could relieve. Friends remarked on his skeletal appearance, his cheeks sunken, his coat hanging loose on his body. Julia and the children pressed him to eat, but he waved them off, resigned to what the cancer allowed. For the man once known for his endurance on campaign, the indignity of wasting to nothing was humiliation enough. The remedies prescribed contributed enormously to his torment. Physicians recommended cocaine gargles to dull the pain, mercury solutions to cauterize tissue, and caustic applications that burned more than they soothed. Others tried searing the tumor itself, a treatment as useless as it was agonizing. These efforts weakened him further, exhausting what strength he still possessed. The swelling at his neck spread to the tongue, tightening his throat until even speech became labored. Those who remained at his side endured it without protest, for to show disgust would have been cruelty to the man they loved. The tumor advanced with each week, and soon it was clear the disease could not be hidden. Newspapers wrote of the sickroom stench, reporting frankly what polite company would not say aloud. Yet through it all, he refused morphine. He told his physicians that he would not cloud his mind, that he had work yet to finish. Pain he could endure, but confusion he would not allow. It was a decision that condemned him to unbearable suffering, but it gave him clarity enough to labor each day. His inability to speak added to the humiliation. At first, he rasped in whispers, forcing visitors to lean close, but as the tumor advanced, he relied on scribbled notes. Those who came to see him recorded the sight of the once commanding soldier reduced to scrawling fragments on slips of paper, his hand shaking, his meaning conveyed in hurried lines instead of voice. For Julia and the children, the vigil was unending. They watched as he faded, recording small victories, an hour of sleep, a brief smile, amid the greater decline. The family feared that the odor, the silence, and the sight of his ruined throat would overshadow the memory of the husband and father they had known. But Grant himself had no such illusions. He spoke little of his body, focusing instead on what might provide for them after he was gone. Julia, who had followed him through every chapter of life, bore the anguish of watching the man she loved become a shadow of himself. That resolve turned to the pen. In the autumn of 1884, desperate for income, he had written articles for the Century magazine describing his Civil War campaigns. The payment was $500 apiece, nearly $17,000 in today's money, and they were praised for their clarity. The editor, Robert Underwood Johnson, suggested that he attempt a memoir, as Sherman had done. Grant hesitated, doubting his own literary worth, but the suggestion soon became a necessity. He could see that time was short, and the book was the only way to provide for Julia. Mark Twain, learning of his plight, intervened with an extraordinary offer. Instead of the modest 10% royalty promised by Century, Twain proposed terms unheard of in publishing, 70% of the profits to the author. It was an act of friendship as much as business, and it meant security if only the manuscript could be completed. Grant accepted, and with Adam Boudreau, his former aide, assisting in research and his son Frederick checking documents, he set to work. By the spring of 1885, he only had one purpose left: to finish the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Each morning he labored at his desk, wrapped in shawls, stopping only when pain or exhaustion forced him to lay down his pen. Each evening his family gathered around him, their hopes tied to the pages that piled slowly on the table. Observers noted that when he dictated passages of Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Appomattox, his eyes seemed to regain their old clarity, as if memory itself gave him brief respite from pain. For Julia and the children, the sight was bittersweet. They saw a man consumed by disease, yet fighting with pen and paper to secure their future. He labored not to preserve his name, but to provide the money that would support Julia once he was gone. In this way, the torment of his final years was twofold. He endured a body destroyed by cancer, and he carried the burden of responsibility to his family. Where others might have sought release in death, Grant fought on with pen, forcing himself to finish the story of his life while the cancer destroyed it. As the end approached, Grant's suffering reached almost unimaginable levels. In June of 1885, he was moved to a cottage in Mount McGregor, near Saratoga Springs, where the cooler air promised some relief. His throat was nearly destroyed, and by July he could barely swallow even water without agony. His breathing grew labored, his voice almost gone, and his body showed the signs of rapid decay. The household became a place of whispers and dread as attendants entered his room with handkerchiefs discreetly raised, forced to endure the odor that clung to him even as they tried to keep his dignity intact. During his final weeks, his health declined swiftly. He suffered from recurrent fevers, the result of infection spreading through his wasted body. His weight had fallen dangerously, his frame now skeletal, and delirium became increasingly common. Observers recorded that in such moments he sometimes drifted into half-conscious murmurs, speaking indistinctly of campaigns past or calling out to his children. Whether these recollections were truly coherent or only the sounds of a man in fever is uncertain, but all agreed that they reflected a mind slipping between clarity and confusion. Curiously, despite the obvious reality, his doctors did not declare him dying until the very end. Friends, reporters, and even members of his family maintained the pretense that recovery was possible, though the truth was plain to anyone who looked at him. The fiction continued, a shield against despair, even when the cancer's destruction of his throat made survival impossible. Public bulletins spoke of encouraging signs or moments of improvement, a thin disguise over the spectacle of a man whose body was collapsing day by day. On July 18, 1885, with immense effort, Grant completed the manuscript of his memoirs. It was a culmination of months of labor, pages written and dictated under torment. His last campaign fought not with armies, but with pen and paper. On July 22nd, he finished the revisions, his task accomplished. The following morning, July 23rd, he asked Julia to sit with him. Unable to speak, he squeezed her hand when asked if he died in peace. This was his last conscious gesture. In the early hours of that day, at 63 years of age, the general exhaled his last breath. But his passing did not bring immediate silence. Across the country, tributes began at once. General Philip Sheridan, then commander of the Army, ordered a day of remembrance at every post. President Grover Cleveland proclaimed 30 days of national mourning, a gesture that recognized the enormity of the loss. Bells tolled, flags were lowered, and millions reflected on the death of the soldier who had saved the Union. During the following days, while the body awaited the funeral, preparations for preservation proved arduous. His emaciated, cancer-ravaged frame presented challenges to the embalmers, who struggled to slow the visible signs of decline. Accounts from the time noted that odor remained a concern, despite the efforts to seal the coffin for public display. Yet even in this diminished state, arrangements were made with care, ensuring that hundreds of thousands could view him as they passed in mourning. The mighty general, who had commanded vast armies, received the surrender of Robert E. Lee, and twice held the presidency, now lay as a body that resisted even the respect of preservation. The contrast was unavoidable. Those who had once known him as a figure of strength now saw him diminished to remains that demanded constant tending, a reminder that even the most celebrated heroes could not escape the processes of decay. The funeral train began its journey northward, carrying Grant's body first to West Point, where cadets stood in solemn tribute, and then onward to New York City. Along the route, crowds gathered at stations, heads bared in respect, some in tears, many carrying flags draped in mourning. In New York, the coffin was placed for public viewing, and 250,000 people passed by in 2 days. Lines stretched for blocks, men and women waiting hours for the brief chance to look upon the coffin of the man they called Savior of the Union. On August 8, 1885, the funeral procession was held, one of the largest in American history. More than 1.5 million people lined the streets of Manhattan. The casket was drawn by 24 black stallions, a sight intended to convey both solemnity and grandeur. Veterans of the Union and the Confederacy marched together, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation that Grant himself might have approved. Pallbearers included Union Generals Sherman and Sheridan, Confederate Generals Buckner and Johnston, Admiral David Dixon Porter, and Senator John A. Logan of the Grand Army of the Republic. Following the casket came President Grover Cleveland, former Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester Arthur, the members of the Cabinet, and the Justices of the Supreme Court. Dignitaries from across the nation and abroad filled the ranks. a demonstration that the general, who had risen from obscurity in Ohio, was now honored by the full weight of the Republic. He was interred first in a temporary tomb in Riverside Park. 12 years later, on April 17, 1897, his remains were placed in the completed General Grant National Memorial, known simply as Grant's Tomb. It was and remains the largest mausoleum in North America, a structure of granite and marble intended to reflect the permanence of his legacy. Mark Twain's publication of the Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant ensured that the family was not left impoverished. Julia received royalties of approximately $450,000, the equivalent of more than $15 million today. The book was both a commercial triumph and a critical success, praised for its clarity, honesty, and unadorned prose. In the end, the work secured not only her financial security, but his reputation as one of the greatest soldier writers in history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.